You found the skeleton. How would you tell people that this you personally? How would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're going to take a look at a talk given by Dr. Tasman Walker at an event called the Seattle Creation Conference on September 26, 2015, and uploaded in December of that year. The talk is Mega Catastrophe, Evidence for a Planetary Disaster of Biblical Proportions. Taz is an engineer with a legitimate postgraduate degree in engineering from the University of Queensland. He, despite not being a geologist, seems to be Creation Ministries International's pet geologist, and normally works out of Brisbane, Queensland. I cut out most of his introduction as I'm not interested in his philosophical musings. I'll just say he's complaining that methodological naturalism is bad for geology. Obviously it's not, as geology is doing quite well and making people billions of dollars each year, all without invoking miracles. One quick note, this video was uploaded in stunning 360p, not even standard definition for TV, so that's why it looks terrible. But let's pick up after he starts actually talking about science per se, rather than the philosophy thereof.
And we mention James Hutton and the significance of his ideas, which have been picked up and are being run with today. And one of the things that he wrote in promoting his philosophy is that just to explain things in the past, no powers are to be employed that are not natural to the globe, no action to be admitted except those of which we know the principle.
Which is to say, you can't just make up whatever fantastical thing you want to explain geology. You have to actually have chemistry and physics to back up your ideas. That seems pretty reasonable.
Of course, the problem is we don't know everything. And what say things happen in the past of which we don't know the principle? Then, of course, we're going to be totally misled.
No, then we will discover that no currently known principle has the ability to account for what we have found, and so geologists will have to look to physics and chemistry to find new options to explain whatever otherwise unexplained formation they have found. This has already happened in geology, but I think we'll get into that later.
But out of this philosophy comes the geological timescale, and I put up a chart yesterday which had that timescale on it in the form of a big table, but it's presented in various forms. This is another way in which the timescale is presented.
Dr. Walker then goes on for an inordinate amount of time, ironically talking about how much time there is in the geological timescale. I'm skipping it.
And Derek Ager, I mentioned Derek Ager, he's very quotable, and in his book called The New Catastrophism, he says here that just as politicians rewrite human history, so geologists rewrite Earth history. Most people think that geologists are discovering things which are objective, which are based on observation, which are agreed. But here's one geologist who makes it clear that it's very subjective, just like politics. It depends on which party you belong to. And he says for a century and a half, the geological world has been dominated, one might even say brainwashed, by the gradualistic uniformitarianism of Charles Lyell.
That's a quote from the single-page preface of the book. Let's see what the context is. Quote, "For a century and a half, the geological world has been dominated, one might even say brainwashed, by the gradualistic uniformitarianism of Charles Lyell. Any suggestion of catastrophic events has been rejected as old-fashioned, unscientific, or even laughable. This is partly due to the extremism of some of Cuvier's followers, though not of Cuvier himself. On that side, too, were the obviously untenable views of Bible-oriented fanatics, obsessed with myths such as Noah's flood, and of classicists thinking of Nemesis. That is why I think it necessary to include the following disclaimer, in view of the misuse my words have been put to in the past. I wish to say that nothing in this book should be taken out of context and thought in any way to support the view of creationists, who I refuse to call scientific." End quote. Dr. Ager, who died some 12 and a half years before this talk, was one of the geologists pushing hard for what is sometimes called actualism, which is to say acknowledging that things like asteroid impacts, floods, and continent-scale volcanism have been major factors in geological history. And believe me, if he'd seen reason to accept a global flood, he was the kind of person who'd be excited. Instead, he spent years of his life trying to correct this kind of abuse of his work. And now that he's gone, Creation Ministries International is just going to continue misrepresenting him.
And that is true, that this particular philosophy was so strident that anybody that dared contradict or propose something which showed any form of catastrophism was ostracized and didn't get any promotions. But things started to change. In the early 1900s, there were some things which were discovered which pointed to catastrophe, and I'll mention that later.
Oh, so despite being ideologically convinced that catastrophe can't explain anything, for some reason in the early 20th century, geologists started explaining certain things by catastrophe. It's almost like they weren't actually dogmatically wedded to gradualism in all things. Sure, some may have been, but clearly not all of them were. Also, Walker just said that geology was subjective. If that's true, nothing could point towards catastrophe unless you want it to.
But in the 1960s, there was a fellow by the name of Eugene Shoemaker who did a PhD on meteorite impacts and the Arizona meteor crater. And as a result of his work, the idea that things could happen on Earth which by processes which were not natural to the globe, which did come from outer space, and that got traction, and it's now widely accepted that these things can happen.
First, that crater is also known as Barringer Crater. I stopped for lunch there once on a drive from Flagstaff to Albuquerque. It's off I-40 in Arizona, although it's quite a ways away from the highway, but if you're in the area, I recommend checking it out. Second, natural to the globe doesn't mean intrinsic to the globe. An asteroid impact is natural to the globe, even if the cause is extrinsic. Natural contrasts with supernatural, so unless you're going to imagine that the only reason asteroids hit Earth is because the god Vulcan decided he really didn't like whoever was living in that section of prehistoric Arizona, then asteroid impacts are natural to the globe.
So these are some of the chinks which have appeared in Lyell and Hutton's ideas of uniformitarianism. So you've got the Arizona crater, you have the Wolf crater in Australia, and many craters all around the world. As a matter of fact, Shoemaker was investigating craters in Australia.
Yeah, this did change Lyell and Hutton's ideas, because they didn't realize that bolides, that is anything hitting Earth from space, were real. In fact, until that became clear, impact craters on Earth were explained as the calderas of extinct volcanoes. So while there has been a resurgence of catastrophic explanations for some features of geology, that does not negate the fact that many geological formations cannot be explained that way. For example, if we find sandstone with extensive bioturbations, that is, traces of animals going about their normal lives, such as meandering trackways, small burrows, etc., it cannot be the result of a flood, because those wipe away any not already lithified bioturbations. Catastrophism simply isn't an option in such cases. Also, I'm here cutting out a story about how a scientist died from not knowing which side of the road to be on in Australia. It's not relevant, even if it is sad.
But the timescale of millions of years is still entrenched. And so it's the geologists, the mainstream geologists, who've got the problem these days because they've got catastrophe over millions of years, which doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction in terms.
Saying a catastrophe happened long ago isn't a contradiction in terms. If I said there was a volcanic eruption 100 years ago, that's reasonable. But let's say I just keep adding zeros. There was a volcanic eruption 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, or 1,000,000 years ago. At what point does it become contradictory? It doesn't, because there is no logical reason why a catastrophe couldn't happen at any point in time, provided that the Earth existed to experience the catastrophe. And even if the entirety of geology could be explained via catastrophe, which it can't be, it would not negate things like the relative and absolute dating of various strata, which would stand. All that would change is how long deposition tends to take and how often it happens.
So what the Bible actually gives us a way of understanding catastrophe on the Earth, the mega catastrophe.
In order to propose a mega catastrophe, you can't just point out that smaller catastrophes have occurred. Those small-scale catastrophes are proposed because of positive evidence, and because the resulting geology is inconsistent with other geological processes. You need to show the actual positive evidence of this catastrophe. But Dr. Walker is talking like the existence of the catastrophe is fait accompli.
And I mentioned yesterday a little bit about the biblical worldview and how to understand geology from that point of view. You start with the timeline of biblical history, the timeline which is based on what people observed, what people who were there have written it down.
It's not clear that any of the Bible was written by first-hand witnesses. The Pentateuch, or Torah, certainly was not. And even if you want to pretend it was written by Moses, then still all of Genesis wasn't observed by him. Basically, none of the parts of the Bible that young Earth creationists use to contradict science have even a hint of possibility that they were written by first-hand witnesses to the events described.
And when you look at this timeline, as you think about and read what the Bible says happened in history, you think about the consequences of that for geology. And most things recorded in the Bible had very little impact on the geology of the earth. But there were two main events. One was creation, when the whole of the earth was created in 6 days, as the Bible describes.
And what did that look like? Which rocks were the rocks of creation? Because even the oldest rocks on Earth, from the Hadean, have evident history. They can be dated. They experienced erosion all the way back then. And after this, there was the even longer Archean, which has crossbedding, shallow water ripple marks, raindrop imprints, channel deposits, conglomerates, etc. And in none of these rocks is there even a hint of things like complex animal life. In fact, we don't even really find evidence of free oxygen in the atmosphere. So is this history just a made-up story God put in the rocks to test our faith? Personally, I would say there is no functional difference between something having a history and an all-powerful being creating something exactly as if it had a history. Either way, the history is evident and can be used to explain features and make predictions, so it existed for all practical purposes.
And the other one was the global flood, where the whole of the world, there was a remaking. The whole of the world was reformed at that time. And so we can draw a timeline highlighting the two significant geological periods, creation and the flood.
But there is no evidence for a worldwide flood. Not even an ounce of historical or geological evidence that indicates even the possibility of such an event. So either it caused no geological evidence, which seems unlikely given the scale of such an event, or it didn't happen. But maybe Dr. Walker has some new data for us.
And then we can turn the timeline up. There's a time scale. You've got the period between the flood and creation going back there. It's the pre-flood era when people lived on the earth, and the Bible describes a little bit about the technological capabilities of those people. And then after the flood, the post-flood era. And we can draw alongside this what you could call a rock scale.
Oh, so we're going to go with the creation as a huge portion of rocks. So we're going to go down the route of God just made it look old, and we're going to go ahead and blame the flood for a huge proportion of the rocks on Earth, none of which show evidence of being laid down in a global flood. This does not bode well.
Which indicates the amount of rocks that we find on the earth. And so, as we envisage this as a hypothetical, it's no different from a physicist drawing up a hypothetical diagram and says, consider the situation where, and they draw this thing up and then make conclusions from it. So here we've got the creation event forming rocks which were formed during creation period. A large quantity of rocks. Pre-flood era, very few rocks were formed, because the processes would have been similar to today. The flood event, the major catastrophe, you've got the flood rocks, and then in the post-flood era, then there would not be very much compared to the flood. So you've got this rock scale.
Okay, so when the waters rise, they should cause a single massive worldwide flood deposit as they erode creation and pre-flood rocks, resulting in sedimentary rocks made of particles of those rocks appearing as a worldwide graded bedding deposit, which would subsequently be eroded by the slower recession of waters. So we'd expect some outflow channels cut into that graded bedding, followed by some more depositions, probably in ocean beds. Too bad such worldwide deposits aren't found. Additionally, since by the time the flood started to recede, everything not on the ark was dead, or at least all the land-dwelling nostril breathers were dead, any layers deposited by the recession of the waters should be devoid of evidence that these creatures were alive, such as tracks, nests, coprolites, etc. But we do not find such layers either.
And we can divide it up a little bit more, and we're just looking at the flood period. There you can say, well, there was a period where the waters were rising during the flood. As the waters were coming up on the earth, the Bible describes that. The waters prevailed and they increased till every high mountain was covered. And then there was a period when the waters were going down, when they were receding.
Alright, so I guess we broadly agree on what would happen. Although I feel like I should point out that erosion at point A is usually the same as deposition at point B, so it's not like the receding water can erode everywhere. It'll have to deposit eroded flood sediments in some places.
And the Bible describes that as well. It talks about the waters receded and Noah was in the ark trying to figure out when the land would be dry, releasing the raven, releasing the dove. So there's the recessive stage. So the inundation involves deposition of sediments. The receding stage involves the erosion of landscapes. And we can add another one, and of course, it is helpful actually. And so just looking at the recessive stage, there was a period when the whole world was covered in water and the waters were receding, and then they were reduced into very large channels. And so we've got this little model here.
See, I agree that we should have outflow channels on a global scale, But we don't, at least not here on Earth. And we know because a planetary neighbor, Mars, has not quite global, but close to it scale features of giant floods. We have flood channels in such places on Mars as the Circumcrease region, the Tharsis region, Amazonas and Elysium Planitia, Utopia Planitia, the Hellas Basin, the Argyll region, and perhaps around the North Pole of Mars. Let's look at one, Cassae Vallis, which is some 1,600 kilometers or nearly 1,000 miles long. Outflow channels on Mars are the result of what have been called megafloods, so they may make a pretty good analog for a global flood that's draining. One of the things that we can notice is that the channel is smooth. It's not branching or tree-like like we see in the slower formed canyons like the Grand Canyon or river complexes like the Mississippi or Amazon and their tributaries. They also tend to be quite broad compared to their length, and also show signs of being braided. They leave behind teardrop or eye-shaped islands where the water ran up against something too solid to easily erode, and they tend to have very wide mouths. Problem is, this isn't a kind of formation we really get on Earth, at least not often. Really, the only place I know of on Earth with such features are the scablands of southeastern Washington state. But a worldwide flood would have placed such features at the coasts of every continent in impossible-to-miss ways, yet no such outflow channels exist.
Now, I developed this just on the back of an envelope many years ago, and trying to figure out how to fit the geological column into the biblical history.
What Dr. Walker here has admitted to is what the academic community broadly considers fraud. You don't try to fit the data to a prior assumption made independent of the data. The moment you do that, you're no longer being scientific or scholarly. From now on, anytime Dr. Walker says anything, we need to remember that he has admitted to being a fraud.
And it turned out to be quite amazingly simple. And there's some rocks in Australia, the ones coloured yellow. They go near to Brisbane, and that's near where I live. And so it just so happens, as I was looking at these on geological maps, these rocks are forming the Great Artesian Basin. As I study them, I found that they could cover a large area. They're up to something like 3 miles thick in places, 2 or 3 miles thick. They're not the thickest rocks, but they're very, very large. And that's one of the keys.
The Great Artesian Basin of Australia is indeed an impressive formation. It is absolutely gigantic, but it is not a flood deposit. All we need to do to see this is to note that it is composed primarily of layers of sandstone, mudstone, and siltstone, all arranged in no particular order, each kind of stone present at multiple points throughout the up to 3 kilometers vertical extent of the formation. I should add that Dr. Walker may have confused miles and kilometers. The presence of any siltstone at all negates the possibility of this being a flood deposit, as siltstone must form in still, calm water, and it takes quite a while to form at all, as the dissolved calcium carbonate in water has to glue the silt particles together, a process that can be observed, and is not what you'd call quick.
A large catastrophe would produce rocks covering a large scale. And in these rocks, we also find the remains of dinosaurs, so animals which were alive.
You know, it's funny, you do find dinosaurs, but no humans or kangaroos. You know why? Because the Great Artesian Basin spans the Mesozoic, but not the Cenozoic. And despite the fact that there is no great difference in the kinds of areas one might expect to find a kangaroo versus an ornithopod like Muttaburrasaurus, no kangaroo remains are found. It's almost like the scientific explanation is the correct one, and Dr. Walker, a self-admitted fraud, is deliberately misleading his audience about it.
And also, in the same rocks, in various quarries, you find this is a tourist place in the middle of nowhere, which is covering up some dinosaur footprints, which were uncovered as people were excavating sandstone rocks from a quarry.
Dinosaur footprints, formed after the dinosaurs were dead or were drowning, in the middle of a global flood, when the dinosaurs were apparently walking underwater.
Right.
So it's very, very simple, actually. Much simpler than I imagined it would be.
Yeah, turns out when you're a fraud, making stuff up and pretending it makes sense is pretty easy. Too bad actual scientists don't have that luxury.
So when we're looking at these sediments that cover a large part of Australia, we can say, okay, they're very large scale, cover a large area. And so that points to creation or the flood. You can't imagine sedimentary deposits covering such a large area which would have been deposited, you know, when processes were very small, like is happening today or in the pre-flood era.
You're wrong.
You're so wrong.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong.
It took over 140 million years to form the Great Artesian Basin, and during that time the sediments that make it up were being washed into areas that were usually at or below then sea level. In fact, the region in question remains mostly low elevation to this day. And which way does water flow? Yup, downhill. So all it takes for this to form over a long time is for water to continue to follow the law of gravity. Now I know young Earth creationists are at about the same level of plausibility as flat Earth, but most young Earth creationists don't deny gravity like flat Earthers do.
And because they contain fossils, then it would not be the creation event, because there was no death and bloodshed during creation. They must be the flood event.
Fossils from animals that never existed would be no more dishonest of God than things like erosion marks and evident sedimentation from the rocks you consider creation rocks. If God is going to lie about the physical history of the rocks, there's no reason to think he wouldn't also lie about the life history of said rocks. So really, if you're going to accept any rocks as having been instantaneously poofed into existence, with all of their evident history being make-believe, there's no reason to think that there might also be make-believe fossils. Dr. Walker has already basically admitted that God is more or less Loki. You can't trust anything, because he's willing to arrange the world in a way that would absolutely fool any observer, and being perfect, he can do it perfectly, presumably.
But then these sediments contain footprints. That means the animals that were making them were alive, and so if it happened during the flood, it must have happened in the early stages, before the waters covered the whole of the earth, and so it must be the inundation stage, the inundatory stage, not the recessive stage.
Okay, one of the ways geologists can tell that a layer is a flood layer is that floods have this wonderful habit of wiping out ichnofossils, that is, things like trackways and burrows. So no, there is no stage of a flood that can preserve footprints. And footprints are found at all levels of the stratigraphic column. So even if the flood could have preserved any footprints, how could it preserve multiple trackways made by different faunas vertically stacked on top of each other? It couldn't. Just remember the last time you were at the beach and walking on the sand where the waves were breaking. Each wave removes most of the definition of the footprint, and that's just a regular old gentle wave. Imagine a surging global flood.
So you can actually draw a line on this little column here, indicating where these deposits, these yellow ones, can be found. And there's, on the creation.com website, you can go there and you can find biblical model, and you can actually download free charts of this thing. So I indicated last night on the geologic time scale, the one that I put up, of course the dates you get rid of, and this period is as the waters were rising.
So wait, even though it doesn't make sense, we're supposed to just think that fossil trackways mean rising waters, and that receding waters won't have trackways. We've also just been shown a chart where rising waters are from the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. So that means that Cenozoic rocks must be from receding waters or post-flood waters, and therefore we shouldn't find any Cenozoic trackways. Too bad the famous Laetoli hominin tracks are from the Cenozoic. Also, the lower Eocene Chuckanut Formation preserves bird, turtle, crocodilian, and mammal tracks in northwest Washington state. So I guess that's a failed prediction for this flood model.
Most of the column, and the part that's shown here is really only showing the part which has got fossils in it. You've got the Precambrian, which is many, many times over. It extends perhaps 10 times down below there.
Wait, so how much of the Precambrian is flood rock? Why aren't there fossils in it? It's not like there's no life in the types of environments that would be first hit by the flood. Dr. Walker really is just making stuff up as he goes, it seems.
And so mostly as the waters were rising. This part as the waters were falling, surprisingly not enough, but then again it's not surprising, because as the waters were falling, it wasn't depositing sediments, it was eroding sediments. And then at the last part here, the post-flood era.
Wait, that chart says that post-flood rocks are the Quaternary rocks, which is to say Holocene and Pleistocene. So all the fossils from that period are post-flood? That's a whole lot of fossils.
Rocks formed during the post-flood.
You can't erode without depositing. Just think about it. Erosion is when you take bits of rock away from a place. But then what happens to those bits of rock? They don't tend to end up in space or something. So unless the flood just magically deleted the eroded material from existence, it has to go somewhere. And the reverse is true. You can't deposit sediment unless the sediment was eroded from somewhere else. Sediment doesn't just fall out of the sky from nowhere, and when it's eroded, it doesn't fall into a black hole never to be seen again. At this point, Dr. Walker takes nearly a minute of rambling to say Sicker Point in Scotland is where Hutton did a lot of his research, and there's a plaque there. I'm skipping that.
And it says there most people at this time thought the world no older than a few thousand years. Now, why would that be? Why would they think that the world was only a few thousand years old?
Because a simple reading of the Bible leaves that impression.
I mean, people in India believed it was unimaginably old. People in Egypt believed it was very old.
In fact, traditional Hinduism would say that the world is much older than it is commonly believed. I'd actually like to do some videos about Hinduism-based pseudo-history, but I have no idea where to begin finding such things in a language I can understand. If you're watching this and know where to find such things, send them my way.
You know, people in China, well, they're not quite sure about that, but certainly in Europe, they believed it was only a few thousand years old. And of course, that comes from the biblical account. The Bible clearly teaches the age of the earth through the genealogies and other things. But it says here, Hutton realized that geological time is virtually unlimited. Well, he didn't actually realize that. It came from that philosophy where he said we can't use anything that we don't understand, that we can't see happening today.
It wasn't just that. Even if we don't make the assumption that we need currently observable processes to explain geology, when we see current processes making rocks today, which we do, the parsimonious explanation is that the same kind of rocks in the past were formed by the same or nearly the same processes in the past. And the fact is that many of these processes are slow, and there really isn't a way to speed them up and have that not be apparent in the rocks. So even without the stricter parts of uniformitarianism, Hutton had plenty of evidence to conclude that the world had to be at least a few million years old.
And so it wasn't a realization. He assumed that geological time was virtually unlimited.
No.
It wasn't an assumption. The assumptions he made were basically to discount magic and to stick to steady processes. One of these isn't really valid because catastrophes do occur, but they are also not so pervasive as to explain the majority of the geology of Earth. But the other assumption is one of the basics of science. Because the supernatural is fundamentally beyond natural law, assuming it exists, it cannot be studied in the same predictable way as nature, so it's not a scientifically useful explanation. If a miracle were to occur, the best science could do would be to say that no explanation is forthcoming. It turns out that even if you only make the first assumption, the world is evidently at least a few tens of millions of years old. There are no other options, so yes, Hutton concluded the world was ancient. He didn't assume it at the outset.
And Siccar Point is up there just to the east of Edinburgh. And when you go down to the place, it's quite steep in the embankments, you can see these rocks. And for any geologist, these rocks are really wonderful. You can just see them up there. It's all cool. I can see them really good on my computer, but this lady standing at what you might term a contact.
Okay, this isn't really relevant, but I've already cut out about 3 minutes of this speech that's currently at about 13 minutes. In other words, so far, a bit more than 22% of this speech has been Dr. Walker rambling on like a dementia patient about irrelevant trivialities, like that the government built a path. I just wanted to stop and appreciate how little he can say in so much time, and the last few seconds are an example of that. I watched these things through several times, so that you don't have to watch them once.
Something that what's around her around her body, you can see that they're slightly reddish colour. And what's down below her feet, a slightly grey colour. And this is Siccar Point. And it's interesting that the Geological Society...
So there really wasn't a point to telling us about that woman and the rocks. He just wanted to show a picture. Sure, whatever.
And it's interesting that the Geological Society of America, in their in-house magazine for geologists, featured creation geology or flood geology, features Noah's flood. It actually is a picture on the cover of the ark, which is about the right size. It's the right dimensions. And it's written by a guy called David Montgomery, and he wrote a book about this. And it says, when geologists unequivocally dismiss the idea of a global flood and recognize Earth's antiquity, so the geologists dismissed the idea of Noah's flood and recognized Earth's antiquity.
I'm not sure what the point is of showing this cover of GSA Today, Volume 22, Issue 11, which was the November 2012 issue. But let's just read the abstract for the cover article, shall we? Quote, for centuries, natural philosophers, their scientific successors, and theologians alike sought to explain the physical and natural world. The now common cultural narrative of perpetual conflict between science and religion simplifies the arguments and struggles of the past and overlooks cross-pollination between those who embraced faith and reason as the keys to understanding Earth history. When geologists unequivocally dismissed the idea of a global flood and recognized Earth's antiquity, many conservative theologians acknowledged that there was more to the past than literally spelled out in Genesis, the opening chapter of the Bible. But some Christians, those we now call creationists, rejected this perspective and chose to see geology as a threat to their faith. In doing so, they abandoned faith in reason and cast off a long-standing theological tradition that rocks don't lie. End quote. I couldn't agree more with this abstract. In fact, the entire article is available online for free and is linked in the description, assuming I remember to do that. Go ahead and read it if you get time.
So that's Hutton's assumption. It's being put forward as if it's a geological discovery. But what happened is geologists have decided that the Earth is old, not based on evidence, but based on that philosophy. And so when they did this, what happened? He says here, many conservative theologians acknowledged that there was more to the past than literally spelled out in Genesis, the opening chapters of the Bible.
Yeah, many theologians decided not to be complete idiots.
And that's what happened, is that many people in the church, because it's to do with geology, it's a specialist field, many theologians felt they weren't qualified, and so they then tried to reinterpret Genesis to fit in with the new geological philosophy.
As a rule, no, theologians are not competent to give expert opinions on geology, and like any layperson, should generally accept the expertise of those who are in fact trained geologists. And if their theology contradicts reality, including geology, then I'm sorry, but their theology is false. There are, in my opinion, two kinds of theology: those that can't be right, and those that could be right. If your theology isn't internally coherent, or it's at odds with physical reality, it's in the can't be right category. Young Earth creationism is in this category.
What they feature as the evidence for this slow and gradual, which is what James Hutton featured, is Siccar Point. Can you see there? That's the picture of Siccar Point. And it's also interesting that in the area there's the ruins of the nearby St. Helens Chapel, which I think is quite iconic as to what's happened with the new geological philosophy.
Ah yes, it's ironic not because Vikings like to pillage churches. Nope, it's because at some point in the future a guy would say the Earth is old, and that's why Vikings almost certainly destroyed some church in Scotland. But more seriously, Christianity is not in some serious decline worldwide. It is declining in some places and growing in leaps and bounds in others, like it almost always has done. I bet you didn't know it, but in the 8th century there were thriving Christian communities in China. They left no Christian groups with any continuity to them surviving today. Accepting science isn't going to kill Christianity, but believing things that are on the same level as flat Earth might kill at least Dr. Walker's brand of Christianity, which is already fringe.
Has sort of led to the waning of the church in the West. So Siccar Point, Hutton's unconformity at Siccar Point. So here we've got two different types of rock which meet, and it's supposed to be evidence of millions of years of time, eons of time, unimaginable amounts of time. So you've got the old red sandstone on the top, the layers of rock almost horizontal, and you've got the Caledonian strata underneath where the layers of rock are sitting almost vertical.
Why might this indicate an old age? Well, it takes a lot of energy to turn rocks from horizontal to vertical, and it can't be done too quickly or the rocks will fracture. Then for an unconformity to happen, those rocks have to be weathered away. Then new rocks must form on top of the old rocks. Each part of that takes time, and not a small amount of it.
And James Hutton said, look, having a look at this, it would have taken eons of time for the strata underneath to be deposited in the oceans. With the way the sediments are washed down the oceans and the rivers today, it would take a long time to build up all those sediments. And then they were uplifted by heat in the earth, within the earth, and then they were eroded down, and that would take eons of time for that to happen. And then you've got the old red sandstone being deposited on the top, slow and gradual. So at this point here, what we're looking at is there's no vestige of a beginning.
Hey, would you look at that? I'm a geology dummy and I got it right. And I mean that. I doubt I could even test out of an intro to geology class. I have had to look up nearly every part of this video for the first time. I had to consult with someone who actually studies geology to make sure I'm not spouting nonsense. But still, it's not hard to see why Siccar Point demands a large amount of time, and why a flood is completely inadequate to explain it.
There's no sign of an end. And so Hutton came up, it was a Hindu idea of cycles and cycles and cycles on the earth, and he really imagined an eternal earth, which of course has been totally contradicted by the first and second laws of thermodynamics.
A few things. Not seeing an evident beginning for the Earth is not the same as thinking the Earth was eternal. Hutton's idea bears only vague and superficial similarities to the Hindu concept of the eternal cycle of Brahma's dreaming states, which bring about universe after universe. Also, make sure that if you're playing Creationist Bingo, you put an X in the box for second law of thermodynamics.
So when we go to Siccar Point, here's a little picture of it. You can see the grey layers on the bottom sitting vertically. And you see the cracks running along. Can you see that? And then you can see the red layers. There's just little segments of them sitting on the top. And of course, when at Hutton's time, he didn't even know. He says, no powers would be employed except what we know.
Hutton says, hey, let's not just make stuff up. And I guess that makes him the bad guy. What should we do? Just make stuff up until it fits our a priori notions derived from one particular and fringe interpretation of a book? Because otherwise we might get scared about the nature of existence? Yeah, I guess you could go with that. Or you could go with actual science and find oil. Because, spoiler alert, when Zion Oil and Gas decided to use the Bible to find oil, it failed miserably.
And so what did he know? He imagined that the sedimentary layers were deposited just like rain. Can you see the little dots there? And so this sediment's going into the ocean and it's raining down onto the bottom, just dropping down slowly and gradually, building up the different layers. And so that's what he imagined was happening. And so, and because of that imagination, he got the idea of eons of time.
Except that's not imagination. That's an observed phenomenon that occurs all over the world. You can't just say that a regularly observed process which results in the observed rocks didn't make the rocks unless you can show why it didn't and what could have caused it instead. And no, magical flood isn't an explanation.
In 1929 there was an earthquake in the Grand Banks on the continental shelf in North America. I think it was up there. And what happened was part of the continental shelf has suffered an underwater avalanche. And you can see there, this underwater avalanche. Can you see it? It's brown rocks there. And part of this continental shelf fell away and it slid right across the bottom of the ocean basin, ocean floor. And it came across as sediment and mud and sand mixed in with water. So it was heavy and it slid across just like 100 kilometers an hour. And they call it a turbidite or a turbulence flow. And so these turbidites, it actually, as it went across the ocean floor, this turbulent flow intersected a number of telephone cables going across the ocean, and they were broken. And the time that they were broken was recorded. And when this was later analysed, some people put two and two together and came to the conclusion that it was this underwater avalanche which had broken these cables and came up with the idea of turbulent flow, turbidites, and as I say, up to 100 kilometres an hour. And so...
Yes, turbidites are deposited quickly, and during what can reasonably be called catastrophic events. But they show evidence of being turbidites, such as graded bedding, ripple marks, ripple laminations, etc. Geologists can check to see if a sediment is a turbidite, and guess what? Most strata aren't. So unless you've got a citation that says all the layers you're talking about fit the criteria for turbidites, then there's no point in bringing them up here.
So this is the first chink in the armor of uniformitarianism.
Sure, whatever. Geology isn't strictly uniformitarian.
Is that these things, 100 kilometres an hour is not slow and gradual, and turbidity current deposits. And so the idea is you get this water that's full of this sediment, the sand and mud, running across the ocean floor. And when it settles down, and it doesn't take long to settle down, you've got sandstone, which is poorly sorted because it's been carried along and hasn't had time to sort into the different sizes. And then you have mudstone sitting on the top of it.
Okay, but what about when there's shale on top of that, and then another turbidite deposit, and then uniform sandstone, and then chalk? That's the kind of thing that we see all over the geological record, and no single flood can explain it. And floods can't even explain the shale, uniform sandstone, or the chalk at all. The ability of a flood to deposit rocks is not a matter of contention.
And also it's discovered that these turbulent flows, they can have multiple ones happening all at the same time, one after the other, running across the ocean floor. And so one after the other, these things form the deposits. Did we get that there? Did you see that go across? There we go, one, and there's another one there. And they just continue to build up. And you find these turbulent deposits right around the world. They're very, very common.
Yep, no one is contesting that. It's the fact that that's not all we see. We see other things which cannot be explained by a flood that presents the problem for young Earth creationism.
And as geologists sometimes say, they're very, very boring because it's just all the same. And so that's what we see in the Siccar Point. We see them sitting on the end. So they've been deposited horizontally, and then later they've been tipped on their end and then shaved off. And so the very turbulent deposits that are there indicate that it was deposited rapidly. So much for Hutton's idea that it was an icon of slow and gradual, a rapid deposition.
Okay, so let's dig into the actual geology of Siccar Point and see if a single flood can easily account for it. Now, the subvertical dark strata are greywacke, which is in fact a kind of turbidite and mostly found in the Paleozoic. So there is in fact at least the possibility of these strata having been formed in a series of catastrophes in quick succession. However, these strata were subsequently uplifted more or less intact to their present nearly vertical position, something that is not done quickly. Then there is the basal conglomerate on top, which is also likely a turbidite. But interestingly, most of the large chunks of rock in this conglomerate are actually from the underlying greywacke. So the greywacke had to have lithified and uplifted before whatever flood or landslide deposited the conglomerate. So this could not have been part of the same event, because there would need to have been time for the greywacke to lithify, be uplifted, and eroded before the conglomerate can be laid down. Then above the conglomerate is the red mudstone. This stone could not be laid down in a flood, and there are several layers of it. So after the conglomerate was deposited and turned to stone, then several layers of fine-grained sediment, which takes a long time to deposit and lithify, were laid down on top. It's really not hard to see why this would indicate to Hutton that a long time had to pass for this to form. It certainly did not occur in a single year, all under a single flood.
And then at the contact between the overlying old red sandstone and the vertical underlying turbidite deposits, if they'd been sitting there and just weathering in the weather for a long period of time, weathering down, then you would expect the hard layers to stick up high and the soft layers, like the mud parts, to weather down low. So you'd have uneven contact between at that point. But in actual fact, when you look at you actually see that the soft and hard strata are cut evenly, indicating that it wasn't slow and gradual weathering, but that it was a rapid process.
The period over which erosion occurs has little to do with how even it will be. Let's assume that the erosional forces acting at Siccar Point that wore down the Silurian greywacke did so more or less with equal force across the extent of the surface. Now, no matter how strong those forces were, the harder layers would be less eroded than the softer layers. So flat erosion is more of a mark that the greywacke does not vary significantly in hardness, not that the erosion was rapid. In fact, we even saw that way back when we were looking at outflow channels on Mars. The harder areas, such as the areas where meteor impacts had hardened the rock, were able to resist weathering from a flood that on a geological timescale was more or less instantaneous, and not slow and gradual. This resulted in uneven erosion, despite the erosion event barely taking any time at all.
And so you can see there's a picture of the contact between the Caledonian strata underneath and the old red sandstone at the top, indicating that it formed rapidly. And also in the top layer, what we find is there's broken rock in the layer that's sitting on top of the strata, indicating a rapid flow that's been ripping up the material and depositing in the bottom layer. A breccia layer, which means broken rock. It can be angular. Also, there's some rounded parts and some quite large. in that layer, indicating that the process over the top was also rapid.
Yup, after the slow uplift and erosion, a subsequent event deposited a conglomerate relatively rapidly after scaring away some of the greywacke.
And when you look at the old red sandstone in the area, you can see that it's got some thick layers of strata, which is sand which is deposited, indicating that it was large water flows. And you can see the crossbeds that this girl is pointing to, the layers which are on an angle through the strata, and again indicating water flow, and you can actually see what direction that it was flowing in.
Yes, those layers of sandstone were indeed deposited by water, but not flood water. In fact, they can't have been deposited by floodwaters, because they have none of the hallmarks of having been so deposited and are instead completely consistent with slow deposition under a steady flow of water for a long time.
And also in the area, you can see some of this sandstone stuff that's standing up. You can see a man standing alongside. It's quite a large exposure. You can see that some of the strata have been distorted, soft sediment deformation, indicating that the sand was deposited and then some sort of maybe earth movements have caused this deformation. So you get a lot of sand deposited all at once, and it's disturbed before it has a chance to solidify and to become really hard.
No.
Uplift of unlithified sediment would result in the sediments mixing and becoming a single layer. It is a strange creationist myth that rock cannot be uplifted or folded after it hardens, when in fact, if it is to preserve the layers, this is the only time it can be uplifted or folded. It turns out that under intense pressure and heat, rock can plastically deform to an incredible amount. In fact, this can and does occur to fossil-bearing rocks, in which the fossil bones of even large animals, like beefy ankylosaurs, can be plastically deformed, warping out of shape without breaking.
And so this icon of many ages, which is taught in geology, and many geologists and students are taken over there on field trips, is actually an icon of catastrophe.
Yeah, basically it's an icon of both the need to recognize catastrophic events and the long ages involved in geology, because both are needed to explain Siccar Point.
And we can put it on our little diagram here. Siccar Point, Scotland, we can show that this is where the turbidites were deposited as the floodwaters were rising, and this is where the uplift occurred that tipped up those deposits, and then they were shaved off, and then the overlying old red sandstone was deposited on the top.
So how, during a flood that's depositing greywacke, did it lithify in less than a year, and what about the flood uplifted it? See, this doesn't work as an explanation. At best, you could explain the oldest layers in a worldwide flood if all you're looking at is Siccar Point. But all the rock after that certainly can't be part of the same event.
So, a large catastrophe is evident, but James Hutton had blinkers on and decided that he wasn't going to recognize it. And you know, it's interesting. I think, did I mention about these eperic seas during the Cretaceous? These seas which covered large areas of the continents.
Ah yes, the Western Interior Seaway in North America, characterized by shallow water deposits, including chalk, which cannot be the result of a flood. Interestingly, both above and below these marine deposits are terrestrial deposits, which flatly rules out a global flood as an explanation for all those strata.
And it's interesting, Derek Ager, one of the things in his Nature of the Stratigraphical Record, he talks about the persistence of facies as one of these surprising characteristics of rocks on the continents of the world. That means the persistence of certain types of rocks. That's what it means. That's all it means. So you might find that the white chalk layers, they persist for huge areas. Or you might find that the old red sandstone covers a large area. So they're two different types of rock. The chalk is one type, the old red sandstone is another type. And he says this, at certain times in Earth history, particular types of sedimentary environment were prevalent over vast areas of the Earth's surface. So here we've got mega catastrophe, mega processes.
No. The geographic extent of a depositional environment tells you nothing in itself about whether it was caused all at once by a catastrophe. A shallow sea that persists for 50 million years can result in a huge area of similar rocks as sediment is slowly washed into it from surrounding areas. That's just a non sequitur.
You see, today, different environments are fairly localized. You know, you have a beautiful environment here in northwest, in Washington here, but if you go a little bit to the east, the environment changes. It becomes quite dry. And so if you go to the south, the environment changes. If you go into the ocean where the sediments are being deposited, different environment. So it's all very close together.
First, these areas are not uniform in their composition. They can be broadly identified as some kind of sandstone or some other rock, but the exact nature of that rock will vary. In some areas there will be finer grains, in others coarser. Some areas will have ripple marks, some will lack them, some will show evidence of shallow water fauna, other of deep water fauna, etc. Second, let me introduce you to this place called the Gulf of Mexico. Sedimentation is occurring in the entire thing, and if it were to be uplifted at some point, it would form a gigantic above-water section of sedimentary rock, much like we see in the Western Interior Seaway or the Great Artesian Basin of Eastern Australia. Another similar area will be the Sahara, where Aeolian sandstone is forming. Third, because the Earth is in an ice age, water levels are very low. This means that the shallow inland seas that allow for these gigantic formations just don't currently exist. But hey, if humans keep pumping carbon into the atmosphere, that'll change, and maybe we'll get a return to those giant depositional environments.
But here, Derek Ager says, these different environments were prevalent over vast areas of the Earth's surface. And in his book, he names, these are a few of the ones that he talks about. The Upper Cretaceous chalk layers over huge areas. The Ergonian limestones covering huge areas of the continents. The coal measures. They also cover large areas of the continents. The Old Red Sandstone, the Basial Cambrian Quartzite. So you've got these particular, something was happening during Earth history which made these rocks cover a large area.
Yeah, that something is that sometimes large areas had similar environments. You can see such areas today. Look at the Sahara or the United States east of the Mississippi. One is basically an unbroken forest but for urbanization, and the other is a vast desert. Assuming humans don't change that, in millions of years, those areas would have a huge area with similar geology. That also happened in the past. So what was happening in the past is basically what is happening now. Large areas can be similar.
And so here we're talking about mega catastrophe, and we see it at Grand Canyon.
No, we absolutely do not.
And this is one of the really cool maps that you can get from Grand Canyon, the cross-section of the area. And this is the canyon here. This is just the canyon. It just looks a tiny little notch in this diagram. And I've only included part of the diagram, and the diagram is vertically exaggerated so you can see it. But you can see this is the plateau over on this side, but you can see the strata here that are going right across the landscape. The strata, and they're exposed in the canyon, they're eroded in the canyon. And then they continue on the other side. They go for hundreds of miles.
I really wish he'd get to a point. This is excruciating.
And so you've got the Coconino sandstone, you have the Hermit shale. So these different types of rock, the different kinds of rock, persist for huge distances. And of course, that is what Derek Ager noted. And it's so unusual compared with the situation on the Earth today. But it's not unusual when you think about mega catastrophe, a global flood, which covers the whole of the continents. And so you see these widespread sedimentary layers covering a huge area.
You know, he mentioned the Hermit shale. But here's the thing about shale. It generally has to be deposited in very slow-moving water, like in lakes, lagoons, river deltas, etc. It can't normally be deposited in a flood. This is because the particles that make up shale are so tiny that the Brownian motion of the water keeps them suspended for a very long time. As a result, they fall extremely slowly, and any significant current will overcome the relatively weak effect of gravity, and so move them to a new location before they can be deposited. Now, there is an exception to this, where in some cases during a flood, the tiny silt particles stick together and are deposited more quickly as a unit. These units of stuck-together silt are called floccules, and their presence is evident in the resulting shale. Unfortunately for the good Dr. Walker, no such flocculation is evident in the Hermit shale. I know because I spent quite a while checking to see if it were. So no matter why these layers are so extensive, it can't be because of a flood or any other catastrophe. It's physically impossible. And to top it off, there are more supposed flood layers on top of the shale, which means that the flood had to stop and become calm for at least thousands of years to deposit that much shale. then let it lithify for an even longer period, then deposit more rocks on top. Maybe the Ark was really a TARDIS and it was only a year-long flood for him. For the Earth, it was millions of years. That'd at least let Noah fit all the animals in. And I'm cutting out another minute of irrelevancy. And now we're talking about a formation in Eastern Australia. You're welcome.
Now, the interesting thing is, this indicates that this particular environment in which these sedimentary deposits were depositing covered a much larger area than actually what we see now. What we see now is only a remnant of it. And you can dig up the geological maps. Geologists are great for the information they provide, the accuracy of their observations and the precision of their recordings and what they document.
Yeah, it's almost like geologists are professionals and experts, not buffoons who have missed what you seem to think is obvious proof that all of their ideas are wrong. When all the scientists are adamant about something, and you're an engineer and self-admitted fraud who isn't a working scientist in their field, but you disagree, chances are you're the one who's wrong.
And this is a cross-section, a geological cross-section near Carnarvon Gorge. The little pink thing at the top is a basalt cap, and that's it sitting at the top of the gorge. And the two young men, people that you saw in that previous diagram, they're sitting on the little point which has got like RE. See where that RE is there? That's where they're sitting on that point. And so what we find here, we can see just how the sediments have been folded.
And right there, we already know this didn't take place all at once. Because 1, a flood doesn't fold sediment, and 2, the sediment had to have lithified already and then slowly folded, because otherwise they would have fractured or been mixed.
So that's one depositional basin, and they've been eroded, and also these other sediments, dinosaur rocks, that's J is for Jurassic, they're Jurassic rocks, and they are actually eroded away. And so there's something has eroded vast amounts of sediment, sedimentary layers, these rocks from the continent.
Dr. Taz said himself in the bit I cut out for time that the area is lush and full of surface water. I wonder what water does to rock when it runs over it. Is it erode it? Is that what water does? I think so.
And this is an example around the world of the erosion that happened, and it fits in with the mega catastrophe of Noah's flood as the floodwaters were receding. So as they were receding, they eroded the surface of the continents.
No.
Here's a satellite image of the area in question, Carnarvon Gorge in Queensland, Australia. First, you'll notice that it has a characteristic dendritic shape typical of slow water drainage erosion, not the smooth single channel of a flood outflow like we can see on Mars. Second, the flow in question ends in the Arcadia Valley, where there is in fact sediment that has been deposited. And you know what it isn't? It isn't turbidite. It isn't a flood deposit. I know, shocking, right? The admitted academic fraud was dishonest about geology.
And so when we look at these sedimentary layers, that's just a remnant of what was deposited at the end of the flood, or as the floodwaters were reaching their peak, and it covered, as the Bible says, every high mountain, every high hill under the entire heavens were covered. And so this would have included sediments around here, but they have subsequently been eroded away.
Except, like I've said over and over, erosion in one place is deposition in another, and there is no evidence of the deposition that Dr. Walker is positing.
Now, in the middle of our country, there's a famous rock called Ayers Rock. It's also the local indigenous name is Uluru. It's a sedimentary rock, and it actually extends for a long way underground. And people travel from all over the world, and they come in their coaches and sit out at sunset to watch the sun on the Ayers Rock as it goes down. Now, it's interesting that the sedimentary layers are made of a sandstone, there's a number of features about it which point to catastrophe, that it was laid down catastrophically. One is the fact that the material, the various grains of sand that it's composed of, is of large and small grains mixed together, what's called poorly sorted, and that indicates that there was not a lot of time for movement of water to sort the grains into their different sizes. Rather, it points to rapid erosion, transport and deposition.
Actually, it points to a shallow alluvial deposition in an alluvial fan or river delta, where the depth of the water is insufficient to sort the grains. If it had been deposited all in one big event with the liquefaction of the sediments, the conglomerate would be graded, and the biggest sand particles would be at the bottom, like we saw on the basal conglomerate at Sicker Point, which Dr. Walker has already brought up.
So that's the grain size being poorly sorted. Another thing is that the grains are angular, again indicating that they were not rolled around and into sort of rounded grains, but again rapidly deposited.
That doesn't mean they were rapidly deposited. It means they were rapidly transported to the deposition site. There's a difference. Rounded grains are the result of spending a lot of time in the water, which tends to happen in streams and rivers that are long, but if a short river deposits grains, they will be less rounded, just because they spent less time in transit to the deposition site. And once deposited, they will be protected from further erosion while lithification occurs.
And a third thing is that the grains not only include quartz, but they include some feldspar, which is broken down when it's exposed to the environment, and yet this rock is nicely exposed.
Feldspar makes up more than half of Earth's crust by volume. It is one of the most common types of mineral there is, and it doesn't just magically decay away when exposed. The fact that a sedimentary rock contains chunks of the most common mineral on Earth means absolutely nothing.
So this is a little diagram showing where Ayers Rock, where Uluru sticks out of the desert.
Have you noticed how all of the other diagrams so far have been neat and professional looking, like they came from a geological survey done by pros? But this diagram looks like a 10-year-old drew it with a mouse in Microsoft Paint? Yeah, there's a reason for that. It's because this is something Dr. Walker or one of his associates made up. I know it's made up because it shows a vertical extent for Uluru under the ground. But the vertical extent of Uluru is unknown, and given that the site is now closed to the public out of respect for the indigenous people to whom it is sacred, it's possible we will never know the vertical extent of Uluru under the surface. So now, besides Dr. Walker admitting to be a fraud, we have a fraudulent diagram. Nice.
And here it is, just a little bit sticking out, and a lot of it is underground, and you can see that there's been a lot of faults and movement of the rocks after they were deposited. A huge pushing around of the surface. And not far away from there, where this rock is exposed, just within a 20-minute drive, you can see these rocks from Ayers Rock. This is called the Olgas. When you drive down here and go for a walk in between some of these heads which stick out of the desert, and these are some 1,000 feet high, something of that order, 800 feet, 1,000 feet. When you walk in, one of the surprising things is you find that this whole thing is composed of very large boulders, which have been rounded, and it looks like they've been carried along by water in a river.
Maybe there are a lot of faults, maybe not. But I'm not going to take his word for it when he shows an obviously made-up diagram as evidence.
And it must have been a lot of water to be able to round such large rocks like this. And when you look at the edge, you can see here you can see the whole exposure is made up of rounded rocks, a conglomerate. And not only are they just rounded, but they all tend to point in the same direction. You might be able to see that they have a certain orientation, and so that the geologists call this imbrication, and it gives an idea of the way the water was flowing. And again, this points to a lot of water, and it points to a high energy and very thick deposits depositing this stuff. So we're talking about mega catastrophe.
Okay, so for Uluru, having sharp corners for the constituent material meant it was deposited quickly. Let's see what rounded rocks mean for the Olgas.
Now, in that area where these two tourist icons are found, it's a little basin, they call it, an Amadeus Basin, which is, many hundreds of miles wide and a couple of hundred miles high, this basin. And this basin has got lots of sedimentary rocks which are laid in it, and you can look again up a normal geological map which is available, and you can see that the sedimentary layers run along and then they're tipped up vertically. Can you see that? So there's been a lot of energy, a lot of movement which has tipped these things up, and you can see that the layers of rock are fairly flat, fairly even, and then tipped up.
Of course, sharp rocks mean mega catastrophe global flood. Rounded rocks mean mega catastrophe global flood. Heads I win, tails you lose. Do I really have to say anything else?
And where they're tipped up and they're exposed, and you drive through the countryside there, well, that's where again, you can see how they've been shaved off. A lot of material has been shaved away. And the countryside is quite flat, pointing to something which has taken these things off.
So what? The flood got underneath the ground and pushed the rock up? What exactly is the proposed mechanism here?
And when you drive through the countryside, you can see where the rocks are tipped up, that they're sitting almost vertical, and you can look along them. You're actually looking along the sedimentary layers as they were deposited.
Yeah, erosion. And erosion, even over a large area, doesn't automatically mean global flood.
Now, the interesting thing is when you look at some of these layers, there's a sediment which is composed of sand that's been welded together or cemented together with quartz, forming a quartzite. It's called the heavy tree quartzite. And can you see it forms various layers, and you can see that the quartzite has got these cross beds in it, indicating that it was deposited under flowing water, and that's the thickness of the strata. And this little diagram indicates something as to how it forms.
Well, I have to admit, this is an absolutely awesome picture. 10 out of 10 for a picture that should make you think rocks are cool.
Now, the interesting thing is when you look at some of these layers, there's a sediment which is composed of sand that's been welded together or cemented together with quartz, forming a quartzite. It's called the heavy tree quartzite. And can you see it forms various layers, and you can see that the quartzite has got these cross beds in it, indicating that it was deposited under flowing water, and that's the thickness of the strata. And this little diagram indicates something as to how it forms.
Man, I'm learning a lot making this video. I just looked up the Havitree quartzite, and while it's true that it was deposited in a high-energy environment, there is no evidence that that was a flood. Instead, it was more likely a continental shelf, and much of the crossbedding was the result of tides, which at this time were significantly stronger than they are at present. This was interrupted by periods of relatively high-energy but not terribly violent water flow, probably from rivers. So again, not a flood deposit.
So if we look at there's three layers shown here, but if we look at the one in the middle, it indicates that these sedimentary layers, they can be anywhere between 1 meter, that's 3 feet, anywhere between 1 meter and 30 feet thick, which is an enormous amount of sediment to be deposited.
No vertical extent of deposition indicates a flood. It could be 42 miles high, and that doesn't make it a flood deposit. That's not how it works.
So that's the first thing. There's a lot of sediment which has been brought in, and for it to be brought in, and it's amazingly, the geologists describe it as being water deposited. And so that means the water would have covered a huge area to be so energetic to bring this material in.
Yeah, water covering a large area is what we call a sea. They exist.
And you can see how the cross beds come down in a nice S shape. Can you see that? But you can see some of the beds, which is a little diagram, it's a cartoon. Some of the beds actually come up and they're turned over. Can you see those ones? They're turned over towards your right-hand side. They're turned over, and they're called recumbent beds or overturned beds. So what it indicates is the water was flowing through so rapidly, depositing the sediment, that the water was tipping the beds over.
But if this whole deposit were just the result of a single event characterized by rapidly flowing water, then all the beds would be recumbent. But they aren't. That's where we get into the smooth S-shaped crossbedding as a result of tidal action.
So we'd look at this heavy tree quartzite. It was deposited from very wide flowing rivers.
Yeah, the recumbent beds probably were deposited by widespread rivers, but the other parts were just sediment rolling downhill along with a steep continental shelf.
So you got a lot of water flowing across the countryside. It was delivering an abundant amount of sediment into the area to be able to deposit such thick layers. It was a huge, flat, shallow, subsiding basin in which it was depositing. And so the water level was increasing.
Yes, land uplifts and subsides. And water levels vary, mostly with the overall climate of the planet. That's not evidence for a global flood.
The basin was subsiding, which is another way of saying that the water level was increasing and as the sediment was filling it up.
No, the land was sinking relative to its distance from the center of the Earth. That's not the same as the water level going up relative to the water's surface's distance to the center of the Earth. Land sinking and water rising are not the same thing, Taz. Now go play with your blocks and remember to share.
And that was high energy water currents. This is just out of a secular paper that you pick this stuff up. The water currents initially, they were reversing backwards and forwards to start with, and then as the sediment was deposited, the water became just flowing in one direction. So you'd think with such a high energy deposit, that this would cover a large area of the continent, and indeed it does. There's actually a number of sedimentary basins in the area. You can see the Amadeus one in the middle, but there are other basins scattered around, and the reason why they're scattered is because the intervening sediments have been eroded away, so these are remnants, and geologists are now thinking that there was once what they called a super basin in the area. They've given it a name called the Centralian Super Basin. And this would have been deposited early in the flood as the floodwaters were rising.
Then why aren't they flood deposits? Seriously, they're just not flood deposits. We know what those look like, and it's not that.
And so we do see these evidences around global catastrophe and evidence of mega catastrophe on the earth.
We do in fact see a lot of evidence for various catastrophes, but none of them are a global flood and mega catastrophe.
And there's a lot of interesting stuff. For example, here's another one that was on the front cover of the Australian Geologist. You can see a fellow that's standing alongside what looks like a big, thick column. Can you see that? And he's with his back against some sandstone layers. And he's standing on something on the bottom, which is actually a volcanic rock. And this is sandstone layers, this is a basalt base, and this is a sandstone column. And this again points to mega catastrophe. So you got the sandstone layers. It's been deposited by water. And while it was still soft, you have the basalt, which is intruded at the base. So the basalt is a volcanic rock which is hot and really, really hot. And as a result of that, it heats up the water at the bottom of the sandstone, and the water circulates. Maybe it even boils. And it produces this sandstone column as a result of the movement of the water. And there are a number of columns that are found, again, an evidence of mega catastrophe.
Okay, so let's just say Taz here is correct. Why does an igneous intrusion into an unlithified sand deposit causing a pillar mean a global flood? Seriously, we're now at the point where Taz here is just pointing to a thing that happened on our water, no matter what it is, and saying, hey look, flood!
One of the guys, a very famous Andrew Mile, he's a sedimentologist and written lots of material and a stratigrapher. He's written an article just recently, when was it, 2014, and he's saying we need a new approach to uniformitarianism because of the disconnect. See, the geologists are realizing this idea of uniformitarianism is not working.
It's not news that strict uniformitarianism isn't current in geology, and hasn't been for like a century. But that does not help a worldwide flood or young Earth. Seriously, why are creationists often more than a century out of date?
The disconnect between those working on the modern and the ancient record. Charles Hutton and Lyell said we've just got to use the modern and apply that to the ancient. And here's these people working in sedimentary stuff. They've been doing it all their lives. They're saying there's a disconnect between the two. The modern doesn't seem to describe the ancient.
Yup, Earth has changed. That's why some rocks that form now couldn't form 3 billion years ago, and vice versa. But what no one is saying is that that lends any credence to a worldwide flood 4,400 years ago. Because we know for a fact that didn't happen.
And that's what biblical geologists have been saying for decades. They've been saying that, and they've been saying it since the time of Lyell. The scriptural geologists have been saying it, and they're saying it won't work, and the Bible's accurate, so what you're proposing is not right.
No, they've been pointing at things and screaming flood like a toddler who just learned the word dog. and doesn't realize that it's not a general word for animal, and so calls everything with 4 legs and fur dog, and then gets angry when corrected. That's the level so-called scriptural geologists are on. They will point to structures that have nothing to do with a flood, or that cannot possibly have been formed in one, and say, "Flood!" and refuse to look any further into the matter. And there's a reason all of them work for places like Creation Ministries International or Answers in Genesis. Places where being wrong doesn't matter as long as it sounds good to the misguided faithful who shovel money at them. It's because if results did matter, they'd be out of a job almost immediately.
And here these people, 100 years later, 1830, 1930, so it's over 150 years later, who are recognizing that it doesn't work.
For completely different reasons than what Taz here thinks, though. Next, he takes nearly a minute and a half to say granite is supposed to form slowly. It was so boring and repetitive that I literally fell asleep at my computer while listening to it to write this script.
But there's a new articles have been published recently, new researchers. There's Clemens, he wrote an article in a whole theme of the Geologists Association of London. He said, granites and granitic magmas, strange phenomenon, new perspective on some old problems.
Yep, the paper puts forward the possibility that granites form rapidly, as in over thousands of years rather than millions. This doesn't really help young Earth creationism though, as it still means nearly all granites are far older than the universe is supposed to be.
One thing about geologists, uniformitarian geologists, there's no shortage of work because the old problems persist and they never seem to be able to solve them.
Except, geologists aren't strict uniformitarians. They're actualists, and they do routinely solve problems. The complaint that there are still open problems in geology is just the complaint that science hasn't discovered literally everything that could possibly be known about rocks. Humans aren't gods, and they don't get to just know everything by hitting on a broadly accurate model. Anyway, that's where I'm going to leave it for today. This is a bit of a shorter one, but the next one will be a little bit longer, and it should be the final episode. I hope you really enjoyed this, and if you did, let me know in the comments, hit like, and if you're not already subscribed, why don't you go ahead and subscribe now, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you're always notified when there's more Dapper Dino content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I'd like to say a special thank you to my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bent Hovind, Jimmy Perry, Ian Chen, Sphincter of Doom, Chris Love, and Henry Hutanen. All of their support helps make this channel possible, and if you'd like to join the team, links to both join the channel as well as the Patreon are down in the description. Tiers start as low as $1, and they get you access to the exclusive, patron-only Discord server, as well as early access to almost all of my videos. However, if a monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there are links to my Teespring store, and of course, liking and sharing this video always helps. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.